After giving birth, I came back home from the hospital, but when I tried to use my key, it didn't work. "Oh, you got discharged today," my husband said casually. "I thought you weren't coming back, so I changed the locks. You can't get in anymore." At that moment, it hit me. We were already like strangers, and he had already started the divorce process. He blamed me, saying if I had apologized earlier, things wouldn't have escalated. He hung up, leaving me with my newborn and a useless key. Anger boiled inside me at how he treated me throughout our marriage. He probably expected me to beg for forgiveness and beg to be let back in. Maybe I would have in the past, but not anymore. He didn't deserve to be a husband or a father. Deciding I wouldn't let him off easily, I resolved to take action. My name is Natasha, a full-time homemaker, 3 months pregnant. I had to quit my job when I got pregnant, something my husband insisted on so I could focus on being a homemaker. While I was happy about the pregnancy, I was also confused. Getting pregnant just 3 months after marriage wasn't what I expected. I wanted to enjoy being newlyweds with my husband, and I always wanted siblings for myself. My husband was thrilled about the pregnancy, eagerly awaiting our baby's arrival every day. But amidst the happiness, there were many difficulties. Shortly after discovering my pregnancy, my morning sickness hit hard. It got so severe that I struggled to even sit up, let alone do any household chores. The house started to get messy, and I couldn't manage even simple tasks. While my husband didn't say anything directly, his dissatisfaction was evident. It seemed to start when I began sleeping early due to the sickness, missing his return from work. "I want the room cleaned up. There's too much dust," he complained one day, frustrated. "And I prefer homemade food over delivery all the time. We're newlyweds, but is this how it's going to be?" His words stung, especially on his day off. Suppressing the urge to snap back, I smiled and explained, "I've been struggling with morning sickness since the beginning. I'd really appreciate your help." I hoped he'd understand, now that he was going to be a father soon. But his response disappointed me. "Pregnancy and childbirth are a mother's job," he said dismissively. "There's nothing I can do. You have to handle it until the baby is born." Feeling a mix of frustration and disappointment, I held back my retort, reminding myself that the baby could hear. Instead, I silently praised myself for keeping my cool. "Fathers can spoil the child once they're born," he added casually before leaving for lunch, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Lately, my husband has been going out to eat often and returning late without even bringing something back for me. I don't hate him. I married him because I love him. But he doesn't take care of himself, and when things don't go his way, he sulks like a child. For instance, before we got married, there were times I had to cancel our dates because of work. He'd get upset every time, and I'd try to cheer him up by treating him or comforting him. Even when he visited my place, he'd complain about things not being perfect, like the cleaning or the food. But back then, I could laugh it off. He'd even stay over for weeks without helping with any chores. Back then, maybe it was my maternal instincts kicking in or finding him charming. But I ended up marrying him. But as we started living together, I began to notice his flaws more and more. Despite seeing his negative side, I kept quiet, hoping things would improve once the baby arrived. But I was wrong. Before I knew it, I had drifted off, lost in thoughts about our situation. When I woke, it was already dark, and my husband still hadn't returned from lunch. I felt a mix of relief and emptiness as I glanced around the messy room. Thoughts of divorce crept into my mind. But then I'd think about our unborn child and wonder if that was the right decision. Overthinking left me feeling more depressed, unable to move. Days passed, and I remained lost in these thoughts, feeling increasingly uneasy. Then, while eating with my swollen belly, I suddenly felt water trickling down my legs. Could it be my water breaking? Panic set in as I hurried inside to check. As I began to feel pains in my belly, despite it being a few days before my due date, fear gripped me, and I called my husband, who was still at work. Despite the pain of labor, my husband didn't show concern when I called him, scolding me for not sticking to the schedule. He had promised to leave work and be there when I went into labor, but now that wasn't happening. Deciding not to dwell on his absence, I focused on giving birth safely. Calling for an ambulance, I made it to the hospital. Even after arriving, the pain persisted. But eventually, I gave birth to our child. My mother and mother-in-law rushed over, praising me. But when my mother-in-law realized my husband still hadn't shown up, everyone began to worry. I, too, had forgotten about him amidst the chaos. Calling him, I asked him to come to meet our newborn. But instead of rushing to the hospital, he demanded an apology, blaming me for giving birth earlier than planned. He even accused me of ruining his schedule. He refused to come, citing work. His callous response crushed me, and I couldn't hold back tears. I explained the situation to my confused parents and in-laws, revealing his recent behavior. Anger flared among them, and my in-laws apologized, but my feelings towards my husband had already cooled completely. I'm considering divorcing him, I confided to my parents. Natasha, that's not something you need to apologize for. My mother reassured me. It's important to follow your heart. Relieved by their support, I still felt guilty for my baby. Tears flowed once again as I cried through the night after everyone left. As I tried to navigate breastfeeding and caring for my newborn, alone in the room, my mother-in-law paid me a visit. After cooing over her grandchild, she began to share details about my husband's childhood. Growing up as a latchkey kid, my husband faced loneliness at home while his parents worked. Though they taught him to be independent, he struggled with the solitude, often crying and causing trouble for his parents. They had to rely on relatives and friends to care for him until they could pick him up. Despite their efforts to encourage independence, he resisted, refusing to heat up his own food or be left alone. Eventually, they sent him to cram school, hoping it would lessen his time alone at home. However, even after being sent to cram school, my husband still resisted the idea of coming home alone. Instead of preparing meals himself, he used pocket money to buy food before and after cram school. When his parents picked him up, he expected them to cook for him. He had been living selfishly, avoiding housework and relying on his parents' care. He admitted, "I hate being alone because I can't do anything on my own." He chose his university and workplace based on their proximity to home, further relying on others. My mother-in-law, feeling sorry for the situation, confessed that they had raised him wrongly. She hoped he would change after marriage and becoming a father, but he hadn't. Feeling strangely in agreement, I realized I hadn't discussed our situation with my in-laws. Unintentionally, I opened up to my mother-in-law about it. Later that night, while trying to rest between nursing sessions, my husband called accusing me of talking to his parents to get back at him for not visiting. Angered by his response, I muttered insults silently, finding solace in my sleeping baby as I eventually drifted off to sleep. As I left the hospital, my husband still hadn't visited our baby even once. Despite feeling a sense of relief, I couldn't shake the strange refreshment as I took a taxi home. To my surprise, the taxi driver helped me with my luggage and accompanied me to the door. As we chatted, I attempted to unlock the door, but the key wouldn't fit. It seemed the cylinder had been changed. Only my husband could have done this. Suppressing my anger, I called him, and this is what he said. "Oh, you got discharged today, but this isn't your home anymore. This is my house, and you and I are already strangers. I've already filed for divorce. If you had apologized right away, it wouldn't have come to this. Don't you ever contact me again." With his usual callousness, he hung up, leaving me stunned and hurt. Realizing I couldn't risk taking my infant outside for long, I immediately reached out to my mom and explained the situation. After hanging up, the observant taxi driver, who had been witnessing everything, returned my luggage to the car and even opened the door for me. His unexpected enthusiasm made me smile, perhaps echoing the sentiment of Schadenfreude, finding joy in the misfortune of others. Arriving at my parents' house, I entrusted my child to my mom's care and sought legal advice. The lawyer listened to my story and confirmed my decision for divorce. Despite my emotions running wild, I recounted everything that led to this point. The divorce papers had been submitted without my consent. leading us into a mediation process. If we couldn't reach an agreement, court was the next step. But my mind was made up. It wasn't just about being insulted. It was about my husband's neglect towards our child and locking us out of the house. I couldn't let such behavior go unchecked, especially with a baby to protect. I instructed my lawyer to seek compensation for the emotional distress during pregnancy, child support, and property division. I knew my husband wouldn't agree to mediation, and even if we did, I doubted we'd find common ground. The lawyer explained the mandatory mediation before legal action, which dampened my spirits momentarily. But this was no longer just about me. It was about securing a future for my child. Rather than endure silently, I decided it was time to fight. Despite my husband's deceit with fake divorce papers, my intention for divorce remained firm. He deserved to face the consequences of his actions. I'm filing a complaint against my husband, I informed my lawyer. Shortly after, my husband was arrested by the police. It emerged that he had been cheating on me with another woman in a different house. Apparently, he had changed the locks right after I was hospitalized and had been living there proudly. However, he couldn't handle the chores or the mess and odor, so he moved in with his mistress. Living carefree there, he was caught off guard when the police arrived and arrested him. When I informed my in-laws about consulting with a lawyer, they tried to contact my husband but couldn't reach him. He hadn't returned to his parents' house either. They never suspected he would cheat, but it had been going on for months. Reflecting on it, there were signs. He'd often leave during the day and return late, claiming overtime. But with my morning sickness and dealing with his selfishness, I perhaps turned a blind eye, preferring the solitude. During the legal proceedings, my husband blamed me, portraying himself as a victim. But his childish behavior only worsened the situation. Eventually, he apologized, admitting his mistakes and expressing a desire to start over and see our baby. I heard all of this through my lawyer, and his request to clean up for once sparked the most intense irritation I had ever felt. That apology, coupled with his selfish demand, topped all the irritation I had ever felt. I instructed my lawyer to convey this message to him, ensuring he understood my feelings. After that, things finally reached a conclusion. Surprisingly, I received a fair share of the property and even more compensation for emotional distress than I had anticipated, despite my husband's infidelity. The house was in his name, so I willingly gave it up without hesitation. Frankly, I had no desire to deal with a messy, foul-smelling house. Regarding child support, it was agreed upon that he would pay monthly. However, I learned from my mother-in-law that he quit his job and resorted to part-time work after the incident became known at his company. He attempted to return to his parents' home, but his father refused him entry. Consequently, he sold our former house and relocated elsewhere. Considering his situation, I didn't hold high expectations for child support. However, my in-laws generously offered to assist for the sake of their grandchild, separate from my husband's payments. While I couldn't bring myself to accept money from them, I expressed my gratitude for their kind gesture. Now I'm back at my parents' house, taking time to rest and recuperate with their support. Eventually, I plan to move out with my child and start working toward a modest but happy life. I'm determined to do my best for both of us.